Thanks everyone for joining us today. Let me share my screen. Well, we're going to talk about a few things today. So the title of the talk is How Do Open Source Companies Make Money? But to really understand that, you need to understand how you actually can make money off of software, full stop, not even open source. So we'll cover a couple of things here. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Fat, the creator of Bootstrap, the front-end framework, for creating this great illustration at one of the previous talk that I just reused, and his slides were open source. So it shows you how useful open source software and content can be. So we'll talk about how software became copyrightable, just spend a few minutes there. The free software movement and kind of how that has slowly evolved. So we started with free software. Open source was kind of the second stage. And then we got to this more open core model that people run today that's very different from what free software used to be, kind of different pros and cons, which we'll talk about. And then the DBDS framework, which is just something that I use to think about developer tools, open source software, and kind of how that fits in the developer workflow. And then we'll talk about a couple case studies of open source and open core companies. About myself, I'm a vice president at 645 Ventures, where I invest in infrastructure, software, developer tools, security. We have some open source companies like Cube.js, StorageOS, Panther Labs. And I was previously a founder. I started a company called Smart Torvi, which was an open source and open hardware home automation ecosystem. It basically lets you create, your own devices instead of having to use Ring and the likes. Great idea, very hard to pull off. The amount of expertise you need on the hardware is more than we expected, which was a big barrier of entry for people. But it was fun and kind of, made me learn a lot about what really motivates people to pay when it comes to open source, when, they can have something for free. And, you can reach me. That's my email, fanelli645ventures.com, Fanel on Twitter. And then I'll have those stuff on the last slide too. So to start, what people don't really know is that until the 70s, you actually could not copyright software. It was just not in the law. So IBM, for example, they would sell their mainframes, the whole source code would just come included with the hardware, because it just was not part of the law. And then in the 70s, the CONTU, which was basically the US created a new department to understand whether or not, technology was actually, a matter of copyright, what that played into the overall economy. And at the time, you also had some companies getting started, such as Microsoft. And what happened is that basically, people might know the story, but Bill Gates and Paul Allen were writing the first basic version for Altair at Harvard. They then went out to New Mexico. They started to sell these devices, and they wanted to build basic for it. At the time, it was still a pretty kind of nascent scene. It was very hobbyist driven. People would want to build their own machines at home, but this was not a mass market movement there. And what happened is that Bill Gates brought a copy of the basic on a paper tape, which was a method of transportation of software at the time, at a homebrew club meeting. And that tape got stolen, it got replicated, and then it got distributed for free to all the members of the club. As you might imagine, Bill Gates didn't like that, and he penned this op-ed called "An Open Letter to Hobbyists," which was published on the New York Times, a bunch of publications. And basically, what he said is, while hardware, you can see the physical piece of it. So you're I have a physical thing, kind of costs money. People don't put the same thought into software because it's free, just written on a screen. So he had this quote, who can afford to do professional work for nothing, which really resonates even today in the open source community. If you think about certain open source projects, I don't know, even Homebrew, the package manager for macOS, almost every developer uses it, but it's just an open source project being maintained by people kind of thanklessly too. And then this really kickstarted this discussion in the US around software. And what happened is that in the 80s, Apple, was out with the Apple II. There was this other computing company, the Franklin Computer Company, that basically here it is Apple II compatible device. But what they really did is take a lot of the software from the Apple II and reuse it, but they didn't really clean it up. So if you look through the source code, there were comments with the names of Apple developers in it, things like that. Apple took them to court. They won 1983, and that was kind of like a landmark win for software copyright. And what happened then, everything that, as I mentioned before, things were just kind of like default open source for a lot. Like that kind of all changed. Like everybody was not comfortable anymore with sharing their source code. Everything was kind of like behind the wall garden, which you see Apple still do today. And what happened is at MIT, there's the creation of this new project led by Richard Stallman. And basically the legend is Stallman was like very frustrated with like a printer that didn't work at MIT. He wanted to fix it, but he couldn't because like HP didn't release the, all the software, the hardware, whatever. And he created this project that basically pushed what he called free software. And he made a very specific distinction of free as in thought, not free as in beer. So you can still charge for the software, but once I buy it, I need to be able to like extend it how I want it. I need to be able to fix it. And this was very, again, like very far away from like the business side of it. Like this was completely kind of like a counterculture movement. Like it was hobbyist people, it was people that program on the free time. They were like very excited about computers, but in the business world, you still didn't have like the term of like free software or like open source. It was just like coming to it. And again, if you read through the new project, like you'll see there's a lot of focus on freedom and community. And this is something that has really started to get lost in the open source world today. Like it's more about what we'll call the city model later. But if you think about free software, it's like a subset of open source. So any free software is open source, but not every open source is free software. And this leads to a lot of discussion in the open source community about what is actually free, what is not, like what licenses are actually valid open source, which we'll not talk about today because this is more of a introductory talk. But it's definitely an interesting area. So what the new did is create their own license, which was the general public license that still today is a pretty popular. It basically leveraged this concept of copyleft. So what copyleft did is, if you use a piece of software that is under GPL license, you have to keep it open source. You cannot redistribute anything that leverages GPL code as closed source. So this kind of like, push people to not take open source work and use it for commercial usage under, closed source. And they were hoping this would lead to free software kind of being either, very widespread in the commercial world because people might be using, MySQL, Git, or things like that as core part of their workflow, or just kind of give people alternatives to the closed source. So you'll see there's a lot of things where there's a closed source thing. So like Microsoft Office is an example, and then there's like Open Office. There's like a free software alternative that has nothing to do with it, but it tries to have feature parity. So a lot of free software in the beginning was just giving people the choice to move away from closed source and having something that was instead open source. And that led to a lot of great projects. I mean, like Git, I don't know any developer that doesn't use Git. Ubuntu, one of the most popular Linux distro. MySQL, like very popular database. WordPress, very popular content management system. Drupal. So it was overall a successful kind of like endeavor. And this definitely led to, over the years, to a lot of discussion between free software and open source, because the free software movement was community driven. It was kind of like everybody, it's kind of like the cathedral and the bazaar model, where the free software movement was like completely the bazaar. Like anybody can come in, contribute, be a part of the community. Let's talk about it. It was people that were doing it again for like either like scratching their own itch or like just for the interest of like building something in public, versus what you see a lot today is I'm making the code, part of the code open source, but I really want to monetize it. Like the impetus was a bit different at the time, and it was very hard to get involved with it. So today, if you want to be an open source contributor, you go on github.com, you sign up, you have a pull request. Like back then, you would have to like find the mailing list for a certain project. You would have to like do all your work locally, then attach a patch to like your email. People will review it, will get merged. It was like very hard, which again goes back to you have to be really motivated to be in it for it to make sense for you to spend time doing it. But this has really changed, and it really started to change with Netscape. So Netscape, one of the first browsers, they then decided to really embrace. It was probably like the first kind of like large Fortune 500 company to like embrace open source. And what they did is they took the navigator, kind of like the underlying software source code, and open sourced it and created, this website called Mozilla.org. And at the time, like Netscape was getting pretty beat up by Internet Explorer in the browser wars. And this was kind of like a way to really expand Netscape's capabilities. And like if you read back through some of the press release, like the excitement that Netscape had was around really making sure the community would contribute. And again, this was met with mixed reaction because the open sourcing was done through the Netscape public license, which was not super accepted by a lot of kind of like open source free software aficionados at the time. What ended up happening is then that was then transformed into what today's Firefox, which has its own kind of like Mozilla license. But this really shows you how the model of free software is moving away from community to kind of like community completely decentralized to a company using open source as kind of like a model of distribution and development with different focuses depending on it. So what happens is that the whole overall kind of like licensing goes from copyleft, which was to GPL and the likes, to like much more permissive models. What permissive means is that if you build proprietary software on top of open source software on a permissive license, like you don't have to leave it open source. You can like just take it, make it closed source as long as you have attribution for the project. Depending on the license, there's different kind of things. But you can see that since the GPL, like most of the licenses being created are like pretty permissive. And this is because if I'm a company and I'm doing open source work, I want to make sure that anything that happens in the open source, I can reuse in my proprietary software. Again, big discussion between free software advocates and kind of like, commercial companies using open source about what really is open source. And, the open source initiative does a lot of work here. We're not going to talk about who's right, who's wrong. But again, this is like a very complicated topic. And I've wrote like a 3,000 words article that's on my website about this, that if you're curious, you can read about, but it's pretty nuanced. And as you can see, like even just in the last 8 years, like copyleft licenses were almost like 2/3 of the overall market. Like if you look at today, like copyleft is like less than a quarter of it. This is driven by a lot of things, even just the defaults that GitHub uses and things like that. But it really shows you how open source is kind of moving from the hobby scene to like a more commercial driven scene, and like the licenses kind of reflect it in ways that, having a GPL could deter a lot of people from participating. So it kind of moves into more permissive ones. And then if you kind of think about the things we talked about, like community driven and whatnot, Nadia Iqbal wrote this great book called Working in Public. And she coined this term of like stadium model. So like, that's kind of what open source looks like today. It's kind of like, there's the pitch, like there's the open source maintainers. They're like doing all this work. They're managing the community, creating software. And then like everybody else is kind of consuming the content, but like it's not really participating. If anything, they're kind of like, booing or like just kind of like heckling you, which really changes the dynamics of like what gets built, the support that it needs, and also like really increases like the speed to burnout, like before, like you might have like an open source community developing software and like people might take a break and whatnot. There's a lot of people that can kind of take it over. Like in a stadium model, you might be like 1 or 2 maintainers on a project. And like, even if you want to go away for like, I don't know, 3 weeks, like there's a lot of work that you're gonna have to leave behind. And again, this is also driven by the lower barrier to entry. So as I mentioned today, like you just go on GitHub, like I run a couple open source projects, like you could go on there today, like ask me to build something and do this, fix this feature. What this does is it's great kind of like overall, it's great that more people are welcome to participate. It's great that more people can contribute to the open source community, but we got to be mindful of like the effect that has on maintainers and kind of like how it makes it very hard for them to really answer everybody. So what that has changed is that now open source went from like a very homebrew kind of like scene to like one that is much more driven by corporate involvement. So if you think about some of the most popular open source projects, say React, like the front end framework, very popular, built at Facebook. Facebook uses it in good part as a recruiting tool. They have some great engineers who are like core React engineers. They can work full time on it at Facebook. And they can kind of give React the support that it needs, given how widespread it is in the web. Same with TensorFlow at like Google. Like Google has a great machine learning team. People want to work on TensorFlow, they're free to do it. Like, they have all the time in the world at Google. If you have a full-time job and you have to maintain something like TensorFlow, it's very hard to do. So that has really changed the power dynamics. And you can go into your, package, the JSON, whatever else, and look at all the libraries they use, and like look at how many of them the person that runs them does it as part of like some work that they do at a company. It's not like a side project. Like a lot of them are like now building them at larger companies. Like examples like Andrew Kane, who works at Instacart, he built a bunch of great open source tools like Blazor, stuff like that. And it's all work that, a lot of it that gets used in production in Instacart. And as open source users, we get to benefit from it. But it kind of like really changes the dynamic of how it works. And again, it changes the licensing, changes a lot of things. And so there's kind of like two different schools of thoughts. You have kind of like open source, like, and again, this is like a lot of the distinction that I do in my head, and other people that kind of talk at length about open source versus open core. And don't tell the open source initiative I call things like that necessarily, but open source in my mind is a product that is 100% publicly available. There's kind of like nothing behind the curtain. Like at any point, I can take it, I can run it, I can extend it. I don't need to ask anybody, for permission or anything like that. And usually what I've seen is this is monetized just through services. So that can be, development services, that can be hosting services, kind of like very basic things that are just things you could do yourself, but you might not want to do and pay somebody. And this is, Red Hat is on the left, but like they've really evolved throughout the years. They were kind of like, Red Hat was really the first open source IPO in 99. And initially all their monetization was through professional services, training, things like that. Today, they have a bunch of kind of like software products, so it's a little different, but it's kind of hard to think about a company 30 years into their lifetime versus like when they started. So I put it on the left. And then open core is companies where the open source project is like a piece of the overall kind of like product suite. And that can be a big part or a small part, depending on the company. And the thing that happens is that if the company shuts down, you usually lose the product that you know them for. So say Apache Spark, like Databricks, it's the company behind Apache Spark. You can run Spark as much as you want. Like you can run your own, workflows, anything like that. When it comes to the Databricks product, that's different. Like if Databricks shuts down, like you'll never be able to get Databricks anymore. Like it's just not open. So there's kind of like different pros and cons to the two. The open source is everything is open. A lot of it you'll have to do for yourself. And certain features that you might want on top of it, you might have to either hire somebody to build them for you. You might have to wait on the open source community to do it. On the open core model, you have the company, the kind of like parent company, so to speak, build the enterprise features for you so that you can get started and then kind of get upsold. And you see it with a bunch of products like Apache Kafka and like Confluent as a company on top of it. MongoDB, and then there's like the MongoDB Atlas and MongoDB Cloud, kind of like all these different products. So, going back to what we want to talk about today is how do you convert your open source users into paying users? And we're going to do one open source, one open core example later. But I just mentioned open source because in kind of like, everyday speaking, like people don't really say open core. Like even if it's an open core company, they'll still say it's an open source company. So I think this makes it easier to talk about it. And the way you really should think about it, or at least the way I think about it, and it's the first time I speak about this publicly, I only spoke about it with my portfolio companies, is kind of like this DBDS framework. So I'm an engineer myself. The way you kind of go about building a product is kind of like these 4 phases overall. It's kind of like discover. So, I'm a developer, I'm looking to do a certain thing. Like I'm searching online, I'm on GitHub, I'm on Hacker News, I'm reading all these different sources and figuring out which tool should I be using. Like, can I trust this tool to like, be maintained? There's kind of like a lot of questions that I'm answering. Once I pick 2 or 3 of them, like usually what I do is I start building something, so there's kind of like this build phase. I start playing around with it myself. I might do, a small proof of concept. If I think it's good, I start, expanding it to the rest of the team. So I might say, hey, review my code on this, or like if we were to pour like your microservice to this, like what would it look like? And then all of this gets towards getting the product ready to go to production. Once it gets to production, kind of deploys the next big hurdle. It's like, how do we go from the source code in my code base to having this actually running somewhere that can be cloud, on-prem, whatnot. Here I require, a continuous delivery tool. I need observability to know whether or not it's running, what's wrong with it, and whatnot. And then the final one is scale. Once I have it in production, people are using it, like now I need to maintain it. That is, doing security updates, that is scaling the infrastructure to meet all the demand that I get, all these different pieces of it. So the way I think about it, and again, I just want to preface that this is still a pretty nascent market, and like I don't have all the answers, so I'll be happy to be proven wrong by people and get their thoughts. But the 4 pieces, discover, build, deploy, scale. I think about these 2 y-axis. One of them is like, what is the value of like what I'm using being open source? Like in the discover and build phase, like the value of being open source is like very high. That is for multiple reasons. First of all, if the product is open source, I'm able to really understand how does it work, what are the limitations. I can usually go on GitHub and see what are people writing in the issues, like what are like common problems with it. I can see how fast do these issues get resolved, So like for a proprietary product, they might have a bunch of bugs that like you're not even aware of because you can't see it anywhere. For an open source project, like you usually know what's wrong with something, and like they might not support a certain like database connection and whatnot. So the discovery phase it's very important. At the build phase, kind of like you start losing how useful the open source piece is as you get closer to getting to production. So like initially say, hey, I'm building, say like Cube.js, one of the companies we're invested in, they're basically a middleware to pull data from different data sources. In the beginning, I might say, hey, I need to pull data from a specific database version that they don't support. The project is open source. I can write my own adapter, keep it moving. Once I get to production, it means that everything I needed to build, I built. So at this point, in the future, I might want to extend the functionality of it, but the reality is that today I'm kind of okay with what is there. And this is where the value of reliability starts to get much more important to me than the extendability. So, I'm going to put this in production. I'm going to have real users using this. It's very important that like it works and it works as it should versus that it's open source. Like if because on the kind of like number 3 and 4, like deploy at scale, it's not an engineering decision anymore. It's like a business decision, like should I use, ask yourself a question like, should I use free software that like works 70% of the time, or like should I use closed software that works 100% of the time? It's like a no-brainer. So like use the closed source most of the time, but likely we don't always have to make that decision. So as you get to deploy, you start looking at the open source project as kind of like more of a distribution model. So like I'm using this library up until now. If I'm the parent company behind it, so say I'm Confluent, you're using Kafka, you built it, you did everything. Now you need to get it to production. Now I feel pretty good about coming to you and say, hey, we have like a managed Kafka product where like you just put the URL in your app and like you don't have to worry about deploying Kafka anywhere. You don't have to worry about redundancy, uptime, everything like this. Like that's very attractive as a developer and like as an engineering organization, because that is not core to what I need to build. So like building on Kafka and like building the actual functionality is like core to my product, but like running Kafka in production is not core to my product. So this is kind of like where you start seeing a very strong kind of like monetization trigger when companies start to get to production. And then the subsequent one is kind of like the scale one. So first at deploy is kind of like, can I get it to run on the cloud? Can I get it to run reliably? Scale is like, okay, now I'm like a large company. I need to build stuff like audit logs, like access management, things that are like very mission critical. And like if they go bad, like it can be very bad for my company. There can be like legal repercussion. Like it's nothing to joke about. And again, in that case, it's like, should I spend engineering time internally to like build this, or should I like trust the people who actually build the open source piece of it to also provide me with the enterprise features? And usually that ends up being the case. What you'll see is that usually, like if you think about Kafka, it has like hundreds of thousands of users. Not all of them are paying. That is because a lot of products like never get to the scale. Like you might build an internal product, like for example at our firm, I built a lot of our internal tools. Like we don't really need, we don't scale up. We have like 7 users, so like I'm never going to be paying, like we use Redis. I'm not going to be paying Redis Labs for their enterprise version. So you'll see that usually, maybe like 1 to 5% of like your open source users are really going to be scaling into your enterprise version. And this is something to keep in mind also, like as you think about what projects actually can monetize. So if a project is like not very widely applicable, you'll find it hard to like build a really large business on top of it, just because the amount of people that are going to pay for it is pretty limited. And yeah, so let's go through a couple of examples. And again, like the Red Hat one is interesting because initially what people would say is like, there's never going to be another Red Hat. It was kind of like a unique model, like very support heavy. It needs to be scaled like by hiring more people basically to support users. So like it's kind of hard to get to large scale in a capital efficient manner. But if you think about the 4 phases and how Red Hat addresses them today. So in the past, they were basically, doing a lot of support on development, doing a lot of training, kind of like things that were not really software, that were more like services on top of it, which was great and got them to a successful IPO. And then, most recently to a $34 billion exit to IBM. But basically at the discover phase, I'm a developer. I need to look for like a Linux distro to like run my applications. I'm looking at a bunch of them, looking at CentOS, I'm looking at Fedora, I don't know, there's a bunch. And I run across Red Hat. So the monetization trigger at the discover stage, it's always the same, and it's content and community. Like you're not gonna sell anything to anybody usually when they're looking for something, but you can build trust in your brand and your product by having a very strong community and by having a very strong kind of like content engine, which helps them answer all the questions that they need to get through while they're building software. On the build side, I might have picked Red Hat as one of the 2 or 3 that I want to try out. I need to make sure that they support all the requirements that I have, and I need to understand how to actually build on top of it. Like you can build things that work, but like they shouldn't be built that way, and that can kind of come back to bite you. And this is where you can start seeing a monetization trigger. So at this point, you'll see a lot of companies, once they get open source companies, when they get large, they all sell like certifications or like courses and like things like that. Like that is for a couple of reasons. And first of all, is actually, I'm a developer. I want to learn about it because I need to build something at work. I can expense the training through my organization. The second one is I'm a developer. I want to learn a new skill and potentially get a new job at a new place. I want to get a certification to kind of prove that I know that. And again, this goes back to the content and community. So like, how popular is this project? If it's very popular and it's in high demand, more and more people will be incentivized to be certified developers in it. So that kind of drives each other. Once we get to the deploy stage, it's more about the organization. So we all agreed in our organization that Red Hat is the right way to go. Now we need to get it to a cloud deployment. We need to get it to our virtual private cloud. We need to get it on-prem. It needs to be deployed somewhere. How do I do that? Like before, Red Hat would have done that through services. Today, they have this Red Hat OpenStack platform that helps you manage like your cloud infrastructure and things like that. Again, like OpenStack is like not useful to you if you're in the discover build phase. So like it's a gradual approach that these companies usually have. So as you mature into like the discover, build, deploy, scale, you'll see more and more things that kind of resonate with you and the issues that you have at the time. And what OpenStack does is it helps you manage your infrastructure. It helps you get your things across different pieces of cloud infra and whatnot. And at the same time, they still sell dedicated support. So you can pay somebody to help you deploy it. You can pay them for certain SLAs and whatnot. As you get to scale, again, there's different challenges. I may say, hey, I want to make sure that my Reddit instance is like able to scale like with the traffic that I get. It's properly secured. I can maintain it very easily if there's any issues. And in this case, Red Hat, and it's got kind of like a Red Hat Enterprise Linux version. And the version has things like, making it easier to deploy security patches with no downtime, things like that, that again, like are not really important to you unless you have like a pretty large user base and have certain expectations about how available your service is going to be. So this is kind of like an example of a fully open source project where I could get Red Hat today, and run it and like do everything myself, and like that will work great. But there are things like OpenStack and Red Hat Enterprise that are sold through Red Hat that kind of enhance your experience on top of the development, on top of the open source project. Then MongoDB is like a similar example, and I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I'll kind of run through this a bit faster. But I'm looking for a NoSQL database. I look online and everybody's like, oh, MongoDB here, MongoDB there is the best document data store, whatnot. At the build phase, what I'm looking for is, does Mongo support my language? So like, I write code in Ruby, like, is there a Ruby to MongoDB ORM adapter? If there's not, I can build it myself because Mongo is open source. So this goes back to like the value in the build phase of it being open source, that like I can really understand what their APIs are. I can understand how to build support for it. I can understand, what data models it supports very well, kind of like what are things that people might have tried before that didn't work. That might be, niche use cases of like certain types of like geospatial data, I don't know, things like that. And here again, there's not a lot of monetization, but what you can do is paid workshops, like you'll see it is Mongo has like they have their own MongoDB live conference. They have like workshops within the conference that are paid, where people can go there, kind of learn about building certain things with Mongo and things like that. And then you can hire people to do kind of like more ad hoc development and use cases for you. As you get to deploy, similarly to Red Hat, it's like I have the database, I build my app, I build my product, I use MongoDB as the data store for it. Now I need to get it somewhere on the cloud so that I can connect to it, and I need it to be secure because it's going to have my customers' data, whatnot. Now MongoDB sells Atlas, which is basically like Mongo as a service, and this removes a lot of complexity from the developer. Like I don't have to worry about, my connection to the database not being secure, like putting the database on a server that is configured the right way and give access to third parties. So that really lowers the barrier to using Mongo in production, which is great for Mongo because they want you to get up to speed as quickly as possible, so that then once you get to scale and like you need even more stuff, like they have a larger like MongoDB cloud, and the MongoDB cloud has a data lake house that has a server listing to build functions on top of your data store. There's like a whole lot of stuff that again you don't need in the early days, but later on it becomes quite helpful because you don't need to use internal engineering resources to build it. So going back to the Helix, Discover is always about content and community. If you're an open source project and you want to build a company, you need to make sure that there's a vibrant community around it, and that there's content or content that supports why your project and product is kind of like the best in the category. At the build level, you can do mostly training and development because at this stage, the customer like hasn't even finished building what they're building. So they still have to prove out from a business standpoint whether or not it's worth for them to pay a lot for your project as a managed service on enterprise support. And that's where deploy and scale kind of come in. So deploy, it's usually like the most basic. It's like we take the project, we host it for you. Like there's not a lot more on top of it. And you see this with open source companies too. So like WordPress with VPN, WordPress engine, websites like that to help you host it online and you pay it. And then enterprise support is, I have it online. Usually at this point you have like quite a bit of adoption for your product, and like you really need to tighten it down. So again, if you think about how many people interact with your open source project at the discovery level versus how many are going to get to the scale level, is like it's way less. It's probably like, again, 1 to 5%. So you need to make sure that you kind of keep cultivating the community and reach as many people as you want to make sure that then you have enough of them moving through the funnel. So I know, yeah, we've been going for a little bit now. So I think that's good for the talk. And I know it's a lot of content, and I'm happy to, I could talk about this for like 10 hours, but I'm happy to follow up with people offline if you're interested in learning more about it. But yeah, maybe, we can do Q&A. You can put questions in the Q&A slot and I can get to you. Whatever works best. All right, Brock Allen asked, many of the examples you have are for full products and are quite large, like Mongo and Red Hat, and those services are easier to offer for monetization. What about open source library that still solve non-trivial problems? I found those are harder to make money from without changing to a commercial license. That's a good point. And if you think about some of them, I mean, big companies like Grafana might be a good example where observability is like definitely non-trivial, but you're starting it as an open source project, so a lot of people are just going to deploy themselves. And then you kind of have the flip side of it, which is Kibana, which is like the Elasticsearch product, which is a fork of Grafana that has instead the SPLL license, so it's kind of like very anti-open source. It really depends on whether, like, just how your company wants to play with it. You definitely have more chances to monetize with a commercial license, but you have to think about, again, like the community that you build. Like if you have like a very open source hostile like license, like, yeah, you'll have more chances to monetize, but like less people are going to want to use you because they don't really see the value in it. And like they're worried that a lot of the work they might do also like doesn't actually contribute to the open source world, but like it contributes more to the company behind it. So it's definitely interesting. And I think we'll see more changes over the next few years. I think this is a changing category, and you have some great people kind of thinking about it. And you're seeing how a lot of open source companies get very, very large. I mean, I haven't checked what MongoDB's market cap is, but it's like the tens of billions of dollars. So I think if you want to build, the thing is like, if you don't want to build a large company, but you might still want to make money off of open source, there's definitely a lot of ways that you can do that with. It's kind of like outside of scope right now because it's like, it really depends on what project it is. If it's deployed, server side, client side, there's kind of like a lot there. But a good example would be, I don't know, projects like Tailwind CSS, I don't know, that are very popular, might be hard to monetize, but like, you still have ways to kind of bring the community in. But yeah, it would be great to learn more about how people do it. I think like, again, the maintainers are like the ones closest to it, and they might be seeing things that are coming up now. So I'm all ears.